Well, hi, my name is Stu Bamick, and I've spent most of my life trying to understand all of my life from God's perspective. That's the theme of this ministry, Consequential Christianity. And today I want us to address the issue of how to become overcomers in our lives. We live in a real world with real problems and real brokenness and real failure, real twists and turns to life, and with a real God. And I want to see what God has to say in some very practical ways about how we can overcome those things that come at us from life itself. And so in this series, I want us to become undefeatable on the inside. That doesn't mean that bad things don't happen to us. They do. Sometimes some very bad things. I've spent my life working through relationships with people who have some awful things that have happened to them. But at the end of the day, in our inner core, in who we are as beings, we can become overcomers. God promises that. And I want you to know that. So I'm going to walk you through some steps over these next couple of messages of how to attack and approach and become undefeatable in certain areas that life just throws right at us. And I want to begin by asking you this question. What is the greatest passion of your heart? What is it in life that really gives you that drive, that gets you out of bed, that focuses, that directs, that energizes, that where you thrive, where you have this sense of reinvention of your life, and it's thrilling, and there's discovery, and there's goodness about it? What is the passion of your heart? So the reason I asked the question, what is the greatest passion of your life, is because of this. Have you ever noticed that truly remarkable people have fully invested hearts in something? That they are able to overcome once their heart gets invested in something. They're able to overcome almost any obstacle that comes in their path. They have this passion, this do or die, sold out, take no prisoners attitude. A fully invested heart is a remarkable thing. It is able to overcome whatever life throws at us. Dick Bass and Frank Wells were people that had truly remarkable, fully invested hearts. They were overcomers. Their goal was to climb the 7 highest mountains on the 7 continents of the world in 1 year. Let me read the list of the mountains that they were going to climb. McKinley in North America, Aconcagua in South America, Elbrus in Europe, Kilimanjaro in Africa, Kosciuszko in Australia, Vinson in Antarctica, and of course, Everest in Asia. And as I said, the kicker was they wanted to do all of these mountains in 1 year. Everest would be the most difficult, 29,000 feet. It's what they call the death zone, where the cells of our body actually begin to die. And Vinson would be the most difficult in terms of the weather, the most severe weather on planet Earth in Antarctica. Now, what's amazing about what the achievement that they wanted to accomplish is that no one had ever climbed all 7 mountains in all 7 continents before. It would be a remarkable achievement. It would be something coveted by the world's best mountain climbers. And they wanted to do it in 1 year. And what's even more remarkable about what you could call their passion, their heart, what's even more remarkable about it is that they were getting older. They were in their early 50s. They were in terrible aerobic conditioning, and neither of them had ever climbed a mountain before. So guess what? They did it. Now, not in 1 year as they had hoped. It took them 3 years. It took them 3 attempts at Mount Everest itself, but they did it. A fully invested heart that has a passion about something is a truly remarkable thing. It is able to overcome the challenges that we find in our lives. And what I'm asking of us in this message is that each of us has something in the depths of our heart, in our inner core, that we're fully invested in, that we have a passion about. It's our Mount Everest. It determines the direction of our lives and the focus of our lives and who we're going to become and where we're headed and what kind of sacrifices we're really willing to make. This kind of heart is what drives us. It's what gets us out of bed in the morning. It's our purpose. It's where we say, this is important to me. I could be devoted to this. I could give my life to this. It's the power of a fully invested heart, filled with passion, to overcome any obstacles which come our way. There was a man in the Bible who had a heart like that, a fully invested, passionate heart. This man began his life as a shepherd boy. He was the youngest son of a family of shepherds, and oftentimes he was the one who watched over the family business. Yet, as this young shepherd boy grew up, he ended up with more fame and more power and more status and more wealth than you could possibly imagine. But what really marks his life is his heart, that his heart has this ability to overcome all of the disastrous things that come into this man's life and pile up on him. David is the true overcomer in the Old Testament. He lived 1,000 years before Jesus, yet he is the central character of the Old Testament. There's more mentioned about David than there is about Abraham or Isaac or Jacob or Joseph or even Moses. He's the central character of the Old Testament. To this day, his star flies on the flag of Israel. He's the truly remarkable man who had a heart and a passion to be an overcomer in life. Now, I want us to look at how he did this and 5 particular areas of his life in which David was faced with overcoming. And the first is this, that he was a great military leader and genius of his people. At a very early age, he shocked the world by taking out the reigning world heavyweight champion, a man by the name of Goliath, with a single knockout punch, a stone to the head. When Saul, the king, said, "How did you do this, David?" David said, "Well, I'm a shepherd boy." "Yeah, you're a shepherd boy. You're not a great warrior. I've got my great warriors here on the side of this valley, and they're all afraid, and I'm afraid to fight the giant." But David said, "Oh, Saul, I'm a shepherd boy. I love my sheep. I care for my sheep. I watch out for my sheep. I am willing to give my life for my sheep. I fight bears and lions for a living. Why, this giant is nothing to me compared to what I have had to deal with out there in the wilderness alone, watching over my sheep." And we're going to look very closely at this story in the next 2 messages in this series of overcoming, because it's an overcoming of a fear in our lives. Now, he overcomes the giant, and then early on in his career, he gathers 400 highly trained, high-voltage warriors. They're shrewd, they're crafty, they're smart, they strike military objectives with lightning speed. And they begin to build this army for David that turns into 4,000, and then from 4,000 to tens of thousands of people, of warriors, of men who will fight for David. They fight for David. They love his courage, they love his passion. They love how he's willing to take on any obstacle and overcome it. They say, we'd rather die fighting for David than to live without him. They saw in David that he was able to overcome any obstacle which came across his path. Now, let's turn from that great warrior to another amazing component or dimension of David's life in which he becomes an overcomer. It's a subtle area, but nonetheless, it's very, very significant that we understand the second component of overcoming in David's life, because it has to do with the soul and with the spirit. So we find that not only is David a great military leader and genius that's able to take his men and to lead them to great victories, to overcome every challenge which comes their way. But there's another component to David that I'm really interested in, and that is not just the outward things that happen, but David speaks in here to the soul, to the matters of the soul. He is a world-class musician and poet. He learned these crafts and these skills very, very early on. He was declared a child prodigy, and Saul called him into his own court when Saul was going through these agonizing emotional depressions and existential Anfechtung, as the Germans say, of despair and of utter panic attack. He would call David, and David's music and his singing, his poetry, would soothe his soul. It was a remedy for the emotional turmoil that David was experiencing. You know, music is a gift from God. It can change our emotions and our feelings and our attitude in a heartbeat. You hear the right song and it makes you happy, or there's a love song and it gives you all these googly feelings about love. You hear something serious that brings some contemplative nature to who we are as human beings. Music is a gift from God. It connects, Luther said, it connects our spirits with God's spirit and our spirits with each other. It's a little triangle that takes place. It's a very, very powerful gift from God. It has the ability to bring us into the presence of God. And here we find David. He is the poet laureate of Israel. His books, writings in the Psalms, are the most well-read spiritual book that's ever been written, those verses that he writes. They are unparalleled in their emotional depth. Oftentimes, I find myself as a pastor with people in their most difficult situations. Oftentimes, when a loved one is dying. And I found that reading the Psalms to those that are dying and to those that are losing a loved one, it has something spiritual take place that's anointed, that brings us into the presence of God, that brings a sense of peace that we can't find in any other way. It's David's words, his music, his poetry. He was called the sweet psalmist of Israel, the sweet psalmist of Israel. David tells us what it's like to cry yourself to sleep. He tells us what it's like to have hope when there is no hope. He tells us what it's like to survive when there seems like there is nothing left in the future. We're surrounded by darkness. The Psalms bring light into our lives. He tells us in the Psalms how to love God and how to praise Him and how to worship Him and how to follow Him and how to be devoted to Him and how to trust Him and how to cling to Him and rely upon Him. The sweet psalmist of Israel. David wrote many of his psalms as he was hiding out by himself, alone, all by himself, alone in the caves of En-Gedi. It's there that he composed this music and this poetry. And what this music and this poetry does is that it has the ability to overcome our feelings with goodness and grace and the presence and the power and the loveliness and the delight of God in our lives. The Psalms help us to overcome where we find ourselves. I love Psalm 3. Thou, O Lord, are a shield about me. And the Hebrew word for shield there isn't just a shield of armor in front of us, but it's 360 degrees where God builds a fortress around us. Thou, O Lord, are a shield about me. You are my glory, my gravity, my weight, my heaviness, my stronghold, that which I can stand on. You're the firmness of my life. And he said, you're the lifter of my head, that when my head is fallen and downcast, as a shepherd would take his sheep and put his hands under their chin and lift them up. When we can't lift our heads up, God lifts them up for us. Oh, the music and the poetry of David, how they become a means of overcoming in our lives. And if you need to turn to some comfort this very moment, turn to the Psalms. Start with Psalm number 1. Read your way through the sweet psalmist of Israel. Well, there's a third thing that David is known for, and that is his fallenness, his failures, his sinfulness. In fact, he becomes famous, this great king who has these highs, has these great lows, and he becomes famous for his sinfulness. When he was 30 years old, David became king of Israel. He established what is called the golden age of Israel. From Dan to Beersheba to the Euphrates to Egypt, David established this great kingdom, the height of the kingdom of the nation of Israel. He established trade routes, built great palaces, established a monetary system. There was nothing that David didn't do to make it a great, great nation, the nation of Israel, in this golden age. And then, at the height of his career, his story takes this strange turn. It's the spring of the year, the Bible tells us, when kings went to war. That is, the armies of the nations that were fighting each other took the winters off. The roads were too sloppy and muddy, and they called a truce and they agreed to re-engage in the spring of the year. So it's the spring of the year. David had always led his armies into battle, except for this year. For this year, he stayed home. And there was a reason that David stayed home. He had seen this beautiful woman. He became obsessed with her. He had to have her. And he did. And he did. And to complicate matters, he sent her husband out to war to be killed fighting for David. He abused his authority over this man who joyfully served his king, who took his wife and then took his life. Well, over time, the story hit the front pages of every newspaper in Israel and Palestine, and he became famous by being publicly disgraced and personally humiliated in front of his people. His life would never again be the same. But he was an overcomer, even of this terrible tragedy and fallenness and failure and sinfulness in his life, as we're going to see in a couple messages. When Nathan the prophet comes to him and confronts him with this sinfulness, David prays and writes and composes with his gift of music and poetry the greatest prayer of repentance ever written. It's Psalm 51. Have mercy on me, O God, according to thy steadfast love. Notice here, he's first appealing to God's mercy and to God's steadfast love. Blot out my transgressions. Wash me thoroughly from my iniquities, for against thee and thee only have I ultimately sinned and not trusted in you. Blot out the transgressions. Wash thoroughly, cleanse, expiate. Expiate me, cleanse me from my sin. And it's in this great prayer that David becomes the overcomer of guilt and fallenness and failure and sinfulness in his life. Well, there's a fourth way in which David becomes an overcomer. He becomes famous not only for his sinfulness, but he becomes famous for his brokenheartedness. He becomes a brokenhearted father. You know how the story goes. He has a son by the name of Absalom. Over time, they have words, they get angry. The son's impetuous, the father's a bit controlling. The wounds escalate until the son finally leaves. They become fully and totally estranged. The son becomes David's greatest enemy and tries to publicly and personally humiliate and disgrace him. The son wants to take over the throne. He sits at the gate every day and asks the people, tell me what's wrong with my father and what he's doing and his rule in this kingdom. Well, one day the son's out fighting the armies with the army of the nation of Israel, And David's one of his chief commanders sees the opportunity to seize Absalom and to kill him. And he does. He thinks that he's doing David this great favor. And so he races back to the capital and enters into the palace and into the courtroom of David. And he says, your son is dead. I've killed him. I've erased and eliminated your greatest enemy in life. You're now liberated and you're now free. And instead of David rejoicing, he's brokenhearted. And he never got over the death of Absalom fully. And he cries out with a brokenness that only a father can know. He cries out these great words that we find in 2 Samuel chapter 18, verse 33. Let me read them to you. When he gets the news and the word that his son has been killed and he's gone, David writes and cries out, "O my son, Absalom, my son, my son. O Absalom, would that I had died instead of you. O Absalom, my son, my son. O Absalom, my son." He really has nothing left to say. He's utterly, completely overtaken with the pain and the power and the darkness of grief at this great loss. Some of you know what it is like to lose a loved one, and the greatest pain I think any parent can endure, to lose the pain of a child. The grief, hurt, the sting, anger, all the feelings that go with that. David cries out. He understands this pain. Yet he is able to overcome. As we'll see in his life, he overcomes. And God provides him a great son, Solomon, the wisest ruler that Israel ever knew, to follow in David's footsteps. He overcomes this great brokenness in his life. And it gives great solace and comfort and care to you and me that as David overcomes this, so can we overcome these kinds of moments of deep, deep, deep personal grief and loss as well. Well, there's one final mark that distinguishes David in his becoming an overcomer, the challenges that he faces in his life. And it goes right back to where we started when I asked the question, what is the passion of your heart? This is the starting point of overcoming challenges in our life. It starts with our passion, because you see, for David, his passion, his starting point in life was always his love and his affection for his God. That he had a heart after God. And it was that heart that allowed him to climb any mountain peak that he faced in his life. We read in 1 Samuel chapter 13, verse 14, these words. When God was looking for a leader for his people, Samuel writes, "The Lord sought out a man after God's own heart and appointed him prince over his people." God was looking for someone who had a heart, a passion for God. And he was going to choose him to be the man that he wanted to lead the nation of Israel. 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 7 records these words. "For the Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks after the heart and on the heart." And when he looked at David, and when he looked at his heart, he saw one thing, one mountain peak, one goal, one final destination, and that was that David had this heart, this passion, this full investment in wanting to love his God, this deep, abiding affection for God. David was a real person, just like you and just like me. He knew what it was like to have gifts that God had given him, and he knew what it was like to have great failures and great brokenness in his life. But David knew one thing in the midst of all of that failure and all of that brokenness. He knew one thing, that although he might fail God, his God would never fail him. That we want to know the end result. We want to know where things are headed, what the direction is, and how things are going to be brought to a closure in our lives. But God doesn't work that way. We want straight lines. God does not work in straight lines. God works in God's lines. It's the doctrine of the providence of God that beneath the visible surface of the things that we see is the invisible hand of God. And that's why the writer of Hebrews says, walk by faith, not by sight, because by sight, things aren't always as they appear. It's not really a clear indication of reality. It's only when we as finite human beings get hooked up with the infinite vantage point and perspective, eternal perspective, that we can understand what God is about and how to become overcomers in our lives. And that's why our passion must be this infinite, eternal God and not our own limited vantage point, to lead us to become overcomers in our lives. Life has so many twists and turns to it. From a human perspective, it doesn't seem like it's always going to work out. But at the end of the day, God promises in this life and or the next that we will be more than conquerors. We will be victorious in our lives. The distinguishing mark of the life of David is that he always ends up in the right place, on his knees before his God. Right on his knees before his God. That before he can become an overcomer, he has to get to the right starting point. And that is his relationship with his God. And when we get to the point where we go, okay, it's complete surrender. I understand all that's going on around me is out of my control. I can't control any of it. It's only that I can rest, as David did, the sweet psalmist of Israel, that thou, O Lord, be a shield about me. You're my glory. You're the lifter of my head. That we become overcomers over anything that challenges us in life. Let me close by sharing another great psalm with you, a verse of a passage of a psalm about David overcoming. It's Psalm 42, verse 1. David's hiding out in the caves of En-Gedi from the forces of the armies of Saul. He's alone. It's dark. He's afraid. He's scared. And he looks out and he sees a deer come out of the forest and drink of the cool waters of a mountain stream right outside his cave. And he writes these words, Psalm 42, verse 1. As the deer longs for flowing streams, so longs my soul for thee, O God. My soul thirsts for God. When shall I come and behold the face of God? David is pouring out his heart in fear in the darkness of the cave. And all he wants is to long for God as the deer longs for flowing streams. He wants to thirst for God, to behold the face of God, to have this passion for God. That is the starting point of becoming an overcomer. And if David were here today, he would tell every one of us, let me give you one piece of advice, the starting point of all of life and of all overcoming, of every obstacle and challenge in life, is that thirst for God, that passion, that God is our mountain peak. He is our goal. That our God is what we thirst for and long for. And it's when we give to Him and release to Him that we begin to become overcomers. And so in this series, I'm going to lay out now in each week very, very practical ways in which we can become overcomers in our lives about various aspects of life that crowd into our lives. And in the next message, I want to talk about the root, source, and cause of this thing called fear and how to overcome it. And I hope you'll join me with this next message.